Hi class, well this is our first video with the flipped session. Today we're going to have a look at an overview, the transition from the medieval world which you explored in Year 8 to the modern world which is the focus for this unit of study. We're going to begin with the idea of the movement of peoples. With the discovery of the Americas by Christopher Columbus in 1492, a new world was born. It's over here in the Americas and also down here in Australia. There wasn't really anything new about the world that had been inhabited by other peoples for thousands of years. And also we can see James Cook's discovery of the east coast of Australia in 1770 extended the reach of the British Empire into the southern hemisphere. In 1788, the British penal settlement at Sydney Cove became part of an emerging world. These places were thought of by Europeans as the New World. There were different kinds of migration. This one here is voluntary. So there were people who wanted to move out of Europe into these new places that had been discovered. The first American colonies on the east coast of North America were established under the direction of King James I of England. The first settlers of North America were investors of the Virginia Company of London, and they established their colony at Jamestown in Virginia in 1607. In 1622, there was another colony established further north at a place called New Plymouth. And this place was settled by a group of Puritans who wanted to freely express their Christian religious beliefs, which they felt they were not able to do in Europe. There's another group, though, if we think about our own history, which is the settlers to Australia. Of course, there were convicts, but there were also free settlers. The first settlers to Sydney arrived on board the Belle Honour, and this was on the 16th of January 1793, and you can see the picture of it here. It was quite a small group. There were only 5 single men and 2 families that could afford the very long voyage at the time from England. Now, early free settlers to Australia were given free land grants, and they were able to get 30 acres if they were a single man, an extra 20 acres if they're married, and then another 10 acres on top of that if they had children. They also got free convict labour, and that helped them to clear the land from the native shrub and forest and vegetation to be something like what you can see here, which is a painting of a residence in Woolloomooloo. Obviously, there were many free settlers that came from England over time, and particularly in the 1820s, word had gotten back to Europe about the plentiful quality farmland that by that stage had been discovered over the Blue Mountains. Other kinds of movement include involuntary movement, and you can see an image here of African slaves. They were transported in overcrowded ships to the Caribbean, and then later on to North America, and they were sold to plantation owners. On the plantations, this particular one here in the picture is a sugarcane plantation, but there are other things like cotton that particularly use slave labour. And they ended up with a triangular movement. So what we get is people and goods being transported around the world from Africa to the New World and back to Europe again. And it's estimated that between 9 and 12 million African slaves were sent to the Americas. By 1860, the population of slaves in North America alone was 14.5% of the total population, which is massive. Here I've got an image for you of a jail gang in Sydney. This was painted in 1830, and if you have a close look, you can see down here that some of them are actually in irons to keep them from running away. This man here is in the uniform. He's supervising the men who are going to be working. So most convicts who were transported to Australia were found guilty of stealing food. So 60% of everybody who came to Australia stole something even as small as a loaf of bread. Interestingly, although slavery had actually been abolished in the British Empire in 1833, which of course Australia was still part of then, there was still a practice called blackbirding that was in existence, and it continued on in Australia for several decades. Blackbirding was human trafficking. Basically, they would take labourers from the South Sea islands. Sometimes they would trick them, oftentimes they would kidnap them, and they would hold them almost like hostages on farms where they would be forced to work. Between 1863 and 1904, it's estimated that about 60,000 South Pacific Islanders were brought to Australia to work just on the sugar canes in Queensland. Another factor that we can have a look at that was something that changed from the medieval to the modern world is imperialism. And I've put here a little mind map that shows you some of the key reasons why there was imperialism by European powers. So imperialism is the idea where a particular country will go and take control of another country somewhere else in the world. So the first reason I've got for you here is technological superiority. The Europeans were able to, and they had better naval technology. They had developed superior weaponry, such as this image here, which shows you a picture of what was called the Gatling gun. And this allowed them to obviously engage in warfare where they had rapid fire weapons. And you can see here it's a bit like a machine gun. And on the top here, that's going to spin around, and that's where all the bullets are housed. It's also on wheels, as you can see, and that's going to allow them to move around really easily. They also had, by this stage, Europeans had steam-powered battleships. And so what they're able to do is provide really fast transport. They have really great maneuverability. They're not reliant on the wind or, of course, on human power rowing. And so this gives them a really significant advantage over non-European nations who haven't developed these kinds of technologies in the period that we're looking at. Another reason, another way that the Europeans are able to take control of different nations is the idea of divide and conquer. And we see this time and time again. Perhaps you remember it from your study of the Spanish in the Americas when they fought the Aztecs. That what the British in particular do, but many other European nations, is that they adopt a strategy that relies on exploiting existing rivalries between native peoples. Sometimes different groups in particular areas aren't friends with each other or have had long-standing wars and things, and so they will ally with one group to crush another and then turn on their original allies. And this means that they can crush resistance from any indigenous groups. Some other ideas about reasons for imperialism by European nations is the idea of trade and wealth. And you can see a picture here of goods being transported in the London dockyards. Up here you can see big boxes are being loaded off a ship. And here is someone inspecting the goods. And if you look really closely, perhaps in his hand or here, it is in fact tea. And so when the Europeans and the British take over new territories, what they do is they gain access to new raw materials. And by the 19th century, this was big business for European powers. If you think, for instance, of India, it was administered for 100 years by a large business called the British East India Company. And what happened was they were able to take the raw materials and the goods from India, including silver, gold, tea, cotton, silk, indigo, which was something that they used to dye clothing, opium, porcelain, and a product called potassium nitrate, which was an ingredient in gunpowder. And they take all these things and they bring them back to Europe, and they're able to make lots and lots of money. The Portuguese, the Dutch, and the French also likewise had similar business monopolies, and perhaps you may remember the Dutch when we had a look at the shoguns in Japan in a previous study last year. Other reasons why Europeans thought that it was a good idea for them to take over other countries was to spread God's message. And in the 18th and 19th centuries, the Christian church really supported the growth of European empires. And this is because it provided new opportunities to convert what they called heathens to Christianity, and they saw it as their duty to bring them to God. Speaking of duty, there's one last thing that was a reason why Europeans thought they should be able to take over other places, and it's because they saw it as their duty to provide civilization to native people. Many Europeans saw their own civilization as superior. They thought they had a duty to improve the living standards of those places. They tried to establish schools and hospitals, and they also introduced European culture. Part of that was that many Europeans were taught to reject their traditional customs, their beliefs, their religions, especially when they don't fit with the values of the Victorian era.